Hi, and welcome to Spin Nation. This is the podcast where we take a deep dive into the data to reveal the forces trying to shape Canadians' perspectives. I'm your host, Laurel Osfield, and here's my co-host, Emmanuel Case. Hi, Emmanuel.
Hi, Laurel.
All right. Well, before we get into today's topic, because this is our very first episode, let's just take a few moments. I want to talk about who we are, why we're here, why we hope you're going to join us on this journey together. Emmanuel and I are co-founders of a company called 996 Advisors, and we are a data intelligence agency that we help clients understand the people, the strategies, and the forces that are trying to influence people on certain topics or in certain companies. So as part of our work, we're really looking into the numbers behind the spin. And because we spend so much time and we see such interesting conversations, influencers, strategies at play, we thought this would make such an interesting podcast. So we tried to bring it out into the podcast realm. We hope you're going to come with us on this journey. Are you excited for this journey, Emmanuel?
Very excited. I think one of the really interesting angles we want to bring to this show is to look at the emerging voices in Canadian news and politics and really understand how they're shaping this conversation in Canada.
So, we are Canadian. We have lived abroad, but we are based here in Canada. We're very proud Canadians, and we see how these different influencers, different conversations, different perspectives, sometimes it sows division, sometimes it brings people together. There's so much to unpack here. Now, I want to talk quickly a bit about our approach to data so people understand what we're using. A lot of times we'll do our own analysis. So we will look and use what is called OSINT data, which is essentially any public available data. That can be social media, it can be traditional media. We might analyze transcripts, what's being said in Parliament, what's being said by earnings reports, by companies. But we also use just data that's out there. There's so many amazing companies here in Canada that are doing research, doing analysis, and we will absolutely be leveraging that as well. Of course, we're always going to cite our sources and give props when we use data that is not ours. So let's get into our very first topic today. Emmanuel already mentioned we're interested in influencers and influencers' voices, but we want to talk a lot about if Canadians are losing trust in media. This has been coming up a lot. It came up a lot, of course, in the past election. So people are not turning to traditional media. They're looking for alternatives. Emmanuel, you're the one who started with this research. I know you're really passionate about this topic. Can you maybe set some context for our discussion?
Yeah, well, the trust in media is something that has been changing significantly over the last few years. Here's some research from the Reuters Institute shows how it's changed over the last 10 years or so. And you can see there's a definite decrease in trust in media over this decade, going from about 70 points down to under 50%. This has been matched with loss of trust in many other institutions, whether it's in government, business, or even experts. So trust has been trending lower and lower every year. But I think what's a little less talked about is how this is shaped by the political conversation. Here's some really interesting 2024 data from market research firm Pollara that breaks down the trust of folks towards specific media based on their political affiliation. And here, the contrast is quite stark. So if we look in red, we have those that are liberal leaning, and they tend to have high trust in media. You can see as high as 80% or 80 net positive for CBC, but generally a much stronger net sentiment than the conservative leaning individuals who have a lot less trust, very marked for the CBC. The Conservatives really hate the CBC, but a net sentiment of only 8. But if you look at all of the different data points, trust is generally lower across the board by a good margin, almost 30 points. And one thing I'll note, in the list of the names of media being evaluated by Pollara in this particular poll, the National Post is the first one on the list that has a clear right-wing leaning tendency. And even that, you could see the conservative-leaning voters trust it at plus 25, just about the same as the liberal-leaning voters. So really interesting that it's such a low score. And I'll raise, some very long-term right-leaning media like the Sun newspaper, Western Standard, the emerging Rebel media. their score is in the low single digits for conservatives. So what is causing this loss of trust overall is really the conservative leaning, right wing leaning audience that has for whatever reason decided that we can't trust our media anymore. Any thoughts on that?
What you raised there around for some reason. For some reason, the conservatives are not trusting traditional media anymore. I would argue that there's a very clear reason for that. Now, for those who don't know me, which is going to be pretty much most people who are watching this episode, I worked in media relations for most of my career. So working for companies, working with media, I count a number of journalists as good friends. So this is, no comment on that on these people individually, but in general, I have seen in, professionally, but I think has become acute and is being championed by very influential right-wing voices in the US and being reinforced here in Canada as well, that the traditional media is not telling the whole truth or there's bias in the media. I would say there is absolute bias in the media. There's always been bias in the media, and you can go back in history and in different newspapers were very clearly set out to represent one political ideology or another. And I think that does continue today. The difference is you have like the Elon Musks of the world or Donald Trumps of the world who are saying, well, this outlet is lying or that outlet is lying or that outlet is not telling the whole truth. There is, I would guess, a kernel of truth in what they are saying. Now, they have pushed that to as far as it can go, say everything they say is a lie, and that's problematic. I think there's a lot of layover from COVID, and a lot of people are very hurt about what they could believe or couldn't believe. So a lot of trust has been broken in a lot of our institutions, not just in newspaper, but in government, etc. So it has left those on the right feeling like they don't have anywhere to turn to. So they are turning to these sort of new emerging influencers out there, and they at least align with them ideologically. Are they telling the truth, and do they have the same vetting process and legal requirements and code of conduct that traditional media have? No. And I think that is highly concerning. But I do think traditional media has a role to play in why they are here in the first place. And I'm not going to share personal anecdotes, but I have a number of them where I've worked with traditional media, and it was clear that they were not interested in the real story. They had already decided what the story was. They were just contacting for a quote, or they actually weren't giving credence to contrary facts. So they have a culpability in this that I don't think they want to necessarily accept. And I'm not saying this to disparage all my friends in the media. I think the media is super important. I think they do a really important job, and a lot of them great work. But there's a difference between a reporter that you're working with sometimes and the editors, and what, at the top, the editorial slant or bias or opinion might be. We just saw Washington Post Bezos saying, well, the Washington Post isn't going to ever say this, that, or the other. So there is direction that comes from the top down. So I think that's kind of how we got here. I think that's important to say.
So if conservative and right-leaning voters don't find what they're looking for in the current mainstream media set, the corollary is that they'll find these media sources elsewhere. And I think we've got some really interesting data from this organization, Canadian Podcast Listener. They did some research in 2024. And what we can see is that the fastest growing platform for podcast listeners is actually YouTube in 2024, with a growth of 35%. I went to the site ranking. So I used one of the sites that's out there. There's multiple. And I looked at who was ranking at the top of the Canadian news channels for YouTube. And what I found is really interesting. In number 11, on that particular day, your rankings may vary depending on which day, but on that particular day, in the 11th position, there was Rebel News, an emerging media. Ezra Levant, former Toronto Sun reporter, started that in almost 10 years ago. But 1.7 million followers, almost 400,000 views per day. So quite a significant media outlet. And it's growing. It's growing at a rate of 1,300 new followers per day. So significant. In rank number 17, Mr. Sunshine Baby. He's a political commenter and memer. 500,000 followers, and he's got 225,000 views per day. So significantly, this is the equivalent of the audience of a top talk show or radio show in the 90s. So significant audience reach. For 20, Clinton Jaws, he's a former RCMP officer. He's built a large audience, almost 400,000 users in less than 1 year. He's getting 200,000 views per day. So those guys are all in the top 20. The other channels in the top 20 often are CBC and some of the other big traditional media. But what I found really interesting, all of those four channels are sort of right-leaning. And when I looked at the left-leaning podcasters, I had to go down all the way on that particular day to number 40, the Rational National, 695,000 followers, gets a viewership of about 90K per day. Significant difference where right-leaning podcasters tend to perform much better on YouTube.
Right, was the left already has the CBC that you saw in the Polaro data that we showed, that the left already has their sources of news that they still trust. So there is not the same incentive to create counter channels or new channels. But as we saw what happened in the US in the election, a similar situation where the Democrats were relying on traditional media to promote their messages, but the lack of that trust break between the right and traditional media meant that there was a huge gap of the left or whatever messages, in this case Kamala Harris was trying to promote, was not landing amongst that segment of the population who doesn't trust the media. And as we see this, the situation is here in Canada, and this is the part that worries me, that if we collectively can't all point to some sort of source of truth, okay, so what really happened? And it used to be the media. You would wait and see, well, what did the Globe report or what did CBC report? And that's how we know it's true and factual. If such a large segment of the population isn't doing that in the same way, and so they have a discrepancy, like a contrary source of truth to the other half of the population, this is where those divisions and those polarizations crack further open, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's exacerbated by the fact that the algorithms on YouTube and on all of these channels reward engagement, reward, in a lot of cases, negative emotions that get you to consume that piece of content.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about echo chambers in a future podcast. So if you're interested in echo chambers, please watch our future podcast where we're gonna talk and dive deeper into that as well. I think it's a super important and interesting topic.
And I think to your point around the Trump election, if people change their news consumption patterns because there's a certain lack in what they're trying to get. I think a really interesting phenomena is the rise in the last 3-4 months of a podcast called Midas Touch, which has grown in the ranks really quickly right after the US election. So I think a lot of the electorate was unhappy with the results and they needed, some show to really connect with some of their post-election emotions. And Midas Touch was there and offered the right kind of content, and it is one of the top growing sites in the US market right now, apparently bigger than Joe Rogan. So gone very quickly into the ranks.
So what's the next step? We have this growing chasm between different ideologies using different channels. A lot of that based on a lack of trust, or the trust that's been broken with traditional media. Have you given some thought as to what do we do to fix it? I know that you and I sitting in our kitchen, and for those who don't know, we're partners in business and partners in life as well. So we spend a lot of time together. And now we've started a podcast, so we'll spend more time together. So we'll either be divorced or this will be a great success. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see where this ends up. He's giving me the tight smile. But in all seriousness, what do you think the media should be thinking about? Or, we have now a new Carney and he's got his new cabinet. They, are trying to bring national unity. I think he kind of ran on this anti-US but national unity agenda. Pierre Poilievre is still, I would say, a little bit more in that divisive state. We'll see what happens going forward. What do we do? What's the next steps? What should these people be thinking about?
Well, I want to bring your attention to this chart. Also comes from the We Are podcaster. What people are looking for when they choose a particular podcast show, they're looking for three things: in depth. So the podcast listener tends to be somebody who's really interested in a topic, wants to deep dive into it and talk about it for hours. They're looking for a personal connection. And I think this is really important in this world where AI is coming to the fore, and we don't know if a Facebook post is a robot or some AI crap. And podcasts, video content, long form audio, all of those reinforce building a personal connection with the audience, and just, seeing that same person day after day or week after week just builds that relationship. And I think a lot of people are going to look for that in this emerging AI slop universe. So those are some of the key components that help reinforce trust. And if I was to give any advice to our politician, is to reinforce that interpersonal connection, build it out. I think it shouldn't just be with Carney as an individual, because Carney is not the only person in Canada leading Canada, but build that the profile of these ministers, make it sure that it's genuine, authentic, repeated time after time. Not be afraid of doing those hard interviews with some of these new emerging voices that, even though they might be a little hostile, you need to engage with them in order to engage with their audience. And I think in our future episodes about the segmented ecosystem, it's going to show how it's really important to be able to connect with the other side of the divide in order to engage and get those to listen to policy and ideas and politics from the other side. And that's going to be important both for Carney and in particular for Poilievre, or whoever ends up being the leader of the Conservative Party.
I mean, the other thing I would is, I do think that not just the political, but government institutions, think tanks, and the independent, bipartisan NGOs that are out there that, like, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like Kai High as an example, that looks at Canadian health data. These organizations, institutions, they have broken trust, and we can look at that topic, and I think COVID obviously played a big role in that. Maybe that's a topic for another day. But the fact of the matter is, it's broken trust. And I do not think it is acceptable for these organizations to say, well, those people on the right, they're not worthy of the effort. If they don't understand it, they don't understand it, and that's their problem. I think that's the wrong approach, and I think that's the approach that's been taken. I think it's just been, ignore them. They're a little bit too far over there. They're never going to understand, so forget it. Because that does not move us forward. I think that's a bit lazy. I think that these organizations need to go down to bare bones, get back to the basics of communication, reputation building, outreach, as you were saying. Don't shun those channels or those voices. Yeah, they might be hard, but if you shun them, then it just becomes self-reinforcing. Take the hard meetings, have the hard conversations. We've seen this happen successfully. Like, there are some on TikTok. I saw this doctor. He's just a doctor. He had a profile. He has a social media profile where he talks about public health issues. And he sat in a room with people who are very anti-vax and anti-mask and everything, and just had like real conversation. Like I said, what is your concern? And then they just talked about it like reasonable people. And it's a baby step. It's a long haul. There's no quick fix to this, but I do think these organizations and institutions need to take those first steps. I think that's on them, not on those people who no longer hold trust with them.
I think that's a fair assessment. I'd say the challenge is going to be, it's going to be hard for these communicators. They're going to take their lumps. They're going to mismanage sometimes the message, or do it in a way that trying to engage with a more skeptical audience causes them to perhaps not speak the whole of the message that some of the believers would like them to vehicle. And so they're probably going to be attacked from both sides of the issue. But yeah, that's what we need in a good communicator.
We'll be there to monitor it
Exactly.
and report back. So look, this was our first episode. We would love to hear your feedback on how we did. We obviously have more. Look for future episode on echo chamber. We have a bunch that we're going to look at. We're going to look at politics. We're going to look at culture. We're going to look at society, all those tough topics but of course, always from that data-driven approach. I'm Laurel. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you,
and
Laurel.
Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. All right, everyone, have a good one wherever you are.